All right. So let's get this started. Good to be with you again. And I am going to jump right in. I'm going to spend a little bit of time today updating you on what's happening in the world. And from there, we will then resume our discussion of inequality and what to do about it, which is where we are right now in the lecture series. And so again, today's topic will be primarily about policy approaches to inequality. But before I get into that, I do want to give you a brief update on what's happening in the world. And I'm going to start with and focus primarily on the pandemic. It does appear in certain respects that the uncontrolled rise in the pandemic nationally is not proceeding at the kind of breakneck pace that it had been going at for the last few weeks, that the combination of more concerted policy efforts and widespread fear of the consequences of an unchecked spread of the pandemic has started getting people acting more responsibly, which includes, of course, wearing masks, washing hands, maintaining social distance, not going to large gatherings. And so, unfortunately, there are 20 states in the United States that have really seen rapid spread of the coronavirus and of late rapid increase in deaths. And unfortunately, it does appear to be at the current moment that is what was required in order to produce a better response, both in terms of public policy and in terms of individual behavior. When we look at this, what we see is that the United States is really not doing well relative to every other rich developed country, even if we compare ourselves with the countries with the most severe outbreaks, especially if we compare ourselves with the countries that managed to get things under control pretty quickly. The absence of a coordinated national policy has now put us in the place where, as opposed to a single epidemic with a clear epicenter and a pattern that allows for a uniform policy response, we have maybe at least 20 to 30 distinct patterns of virus transmission in the United States. And this is going to be very complicated to address. This is not going to be easy. And in a sense, we have missed the opportunity for an effective, aggressive initial response. And as a result, we are going to be dealing with this for much of the rest of the summer, probably into the fall. Obviously, there have been some hopeful signs that a vaccine may be developed, but I just have to be careful and cautious and point out to you that we are still in the initial stages of testing those vaccines, of running so-called phase 3 trials. And a vaccine has never been developed at this rate before. And so we certainly hope that this will break all the records and that we will be able to develop a vaccine that is safe and effective in 1/5 or 1/10 the time that it's taken to do so in the past. But I also think we need to be careful about subscribing to pure hope. that's what we can hope for. I don't think that that's what we should plan for. And so if there isn't a vaccine this year or till the middle of next year, it seems to me that's a realistic, very fast time frame, then we have another year of managing this in a primarily non-pharmacological way, which is to say we don't have a vaccine. We have perhaps learned better how to treat this, and the fatality rate is coming down, but it is still the case that this is a deadly virus, much more deadly than the flu, and that although we're not seeing the fatality rates we were seeing before, if the virus continues to spread at this rate, the medical infrastructure in regions of the country will come close to being overwhelmed or be overwhelmed, and that will also increase the fatality rate. So all that to say, the news here is certainly not good. It's mixed. It has some hopeful signs in terms of the vaccine, in terms of the decreased fatality rate, but comparatively speaking, the United States is suffering from the failure of a coordinated, concerted, aggressive national response to the virus. And when we look at the states where things are really bad, and I'll just transition into the political implications of this for a moment, we can see, right, that there are roughly 10 states in the United States that are perhaps worse than almost every country in the world, right? Tennessee, Idaho, Texas, South Carolina, Alabama, Arizona, Nevada, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, right? And so what we are seeing is a pattern. And note that these states are primarily red states, that they are governed by Republican governors, and that they have, many of them, relatively elderly populations. And so populations that are particularly at risk from the virus. And so when we talk about the political implications of this, it does appear that this is playing out in a partisan way, that Democratic governors, although they've not been fully successful, have been at least more direct and aggressive in trying to meet the virus threat. And the result is that per capita, Democratic governors are doing better at this than are Republican governors. And there may very well be a political backlash against Republicans in November. Of course, we are now just 3 months from the election, and the result does appear to be, if we look at the public opinion data, I'll share more with you on this next week. Today, I want to concentrate primarily on the virus and its economic impact. But that there does appear to be a public opinion shift away from the Republicans as a result of the virus, that Democrats are receiving higher marks in public opinion for the handling of the virus, and that is even true for Republicans. And obviously that then does not bode well for the Republicans' prospects of retaining the presidency, or retaining the Senate, or retaining a lockhold on state legislatures and governorships. And please remember, we talked about this together a long time ago when we were doing an overview of the election, that 2020 is a census year. The census is not going well as a result of the virus. That's understandable. But At the end of 2020, we will presumably have census results. And in 2021, 2022, redistricting will occur. And so who controls the state legislature will be determined, I should say the state house, the legislature and the governorship in the elections of 2020. And that will then determine how redistricting, the drawing of new electoral lines will take place, presumably for the entirety of the next decade. And so this is a consequential election, and the coronavirus is influencing it in a partisan direction. I now want to shift to the economy, and we got this really quite grim report yesterday from the Commerce Department. And I want to start by putting the economic toll of the coronavirus in historical perspective. This diagram goes back to 1950, right? And so this really goes back to the beginning of modern economic data collection. Prior to 1950, we can estimate GDP, but we don't have the precise data collected with which to get a really clear picture. So we don't really have data for the Depression or the demobilization of World War II troops, the two events that are probably comparable to what's happening in the economy right now. Having said that, you can see that the most severe recession in the last 70 years produced an economic contraction of slightly less than 3%. And that the really bad recessions of the period from the 1970s to the present produced contractions of around 2%, a loss of 2% of the productivity of the economy. And that at present, we are down to a near 10% loss. So this is between 3 and 5 times as bad as the worst recorded economic contraction in modern American history. And I'm using the term contraction so as not to beg the question, is this a recession or a depression? In a sense, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the severity of the economic downturn. And I think many of us anticipated that it would be severe, but nevertheless, it's shocking to see the depth of loss of productivity in our economy. One way to express this is in dollars, right? And so what we see is a $17 trillion shrinkage in the American economy. And if you were to just compare this, right, historically, right, we've come off a rather robust period of economic growth, expansion that actually was the largest expansion, I'm sorry, the longest expansion in the post-war period, going from 2009 to 2020. If we were to look at right where the economy is right now in terms of its overall productivity or the amount of goods being produced, their value, what we would see is that in one quarter, we lost roughly 5 years worth of gain in productivity, right? So we are now closer to where we were in 2015. Now, that doesn't mean that's a permanent loss, but of course, how permanent this loss is depends on how many businesses close permanently. And we don't know that for sure yet, but we are seeing more and more signs that there is a permanent contraction in the economy. That is to say, businesses actually closing as opposed to a temporary shutdown from which there would be an easier bounce back. We're obviously seeing this. Oh, I'm sorry, I've mislabeled this. The consumer spending, let me see if I can find the consumer spending data for you. This is the consumer spending data. And so this is part of what's driving this contraction. I recognize that the diagram here is a little blurred. I'm sorry for that. But there's been a precipitous decline in consumer spending in the second quarter of 2020. Please note the first quarter saw a decline that was larger than any previous recession by about twofold. But the increase in the second quarter completely dwarfs, I should say, the decrease in consumer spending in the second quarter completely dwarfs what we saw in the first quarter. And obviously it's an order of magnitude larger than what we saw in 2008, 2009. And please note that 2008, 2009, right, the recession is this gray period. So there's a little blip downward in consumer spending on services. At the beginning of the recession, it actually picks back up and then it comes back down. There was time for businesses to adjust to the idea that consumer spending would be decreasing, and then it decreased slightly. What we see here is that we fell off a cliff, right? And then that cliff turned into a chasm in terms of the extent of the downturn in spending. So businesses both did not have time to anticipate and plan for this, and are experiencing a downturn that is really without precedent in modern American economic history. So that's what's happening with consumer spending. Obviously, this diagram is mislabeled. This is what's happening in terms of employment. What you see here is that the unemployment figures, and I could take them back. Let me show you a slightly longer picture here, right? Going back to 2016, we see records of around 200,000 new unemployment claims in a week. And what we see in the aftermath of the pandemic's economic impact is an increase in unemployment claims of 6 to 7 million. And that there hasn't been, now let me go back to the shorter term picture, a week since the middle of March in which we've had fewer than 1 million new unemployment claims. And in fact, the unemployment claims after going down in June have stabilized and actually started to come up a little bit in July. And so this is totally to be expected. You don't see an economic contraction that's greater than $1 trillion that results in a dramatic decline in productivity, a huge decrease in consumer spending without rising unemployment. Now to just focus for a moment on what's happening politically with regards to unemployment, I will remind you that we have had a special unemployment bump built into the CARES legislation, the bailout legislation that was passed in March that expired today, right? And end of July. And so to be clear, what this supplemental benefit did was add $600 to the unemployment checks that people receive on a weekly basis. And so what this diagram does, and I think it's a very helpful diagram, is it shows you what the unemployment benefit would have been had people not received the $600 bonus. That's these bottom white dots, right? And it shows it both in terms of actual benefit. So if you're earning around $15,000 a year, your unemployment benefit would be around $200 a week. If you're earning $20,000, it would be around $250, right? If you're earning $25,000, it would be around $300, right? And as opposed to that, with the $600 supplement, people were earning $750, $800 a week, $600 more than they would have been receiving in benefits. And this also shows a 70% of income replacement rate, which is one of the Republican proposals. Other proposals include a $200 as opposed to a $600 supplement. And what this shows then is, as a percentage of the value, as you can see, unemployment benefits generally replace around 40 to 60% of the income. As you get up into the higher income brackets, 20 to 40%. With that $600 supplement, it was replacing for lower income people earning $50,000 a year or less, more than 100% of their income. And I do have to point out to you, the Republicans do have a point when they suggest that if you give people more in unemployment than they make from being employed, you create a so-called moral hazard or perverse incentive. The hazard is that people will find it actually more beneficial not to work than to work. And so if new jobs are being created, if the opportunity to go back to work is there, your existing job comes back online, you probably don't want a benefit set this high because it disincentivizes people to go back to work. However, what we've just seen, right, is that unemployment is way up and remaining up. And we've seen why it's up so high. The economy has contracted in a way that it has rarely contracted since probably the Great Depression or the end of World War II. We have fallen off a productivity cliff. And so in that scenario, what these unemployment benefits do is they stimulate the economy, right? Remember, all of those data on contraction and the loss of productivity are after this $600 benefit has propped up the economy. So if we take this $600 benefit away, which is happening right now, two things will happen. The first is that many of these families will become much more economically desperate. We've seen tenfold increases in the number of people using food pantries in some places in the United States. I think on average, more than double the number of people using food pantries from before the pandemic caused recession. And that's even with people receiving these benefits, right? And so individually, the humane or human impact of this is going to be severe on poor or recently impoverished families. But in addition to that, there is the economic impact on the economy as a whole, right? And you might argue that there are better ways to do stimulus spending. That's an interesting policy debate to have. But one thing is clear. This has been a huge stimulus to the economy. And if we take away this benefit, which is happening right now, then the economy is likely to contract further. So that, unfortunately, is the grim report on the virus and its economic consequences. Let me stop for a moment and see if any of you have questions. As I said, I'm focusing more on the economics and less on the politics of this, though I've mentioned the politics as well. I'll return to the politics more next week. Anybody have a question or a comment to do with what's happening in the economy, with the virus, with politics that you'd like to ask at this point? I'm going to unmute everyone, try to minimize the background noise while everybody has the opportunity to speak. Anybody have a question at this point? Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, but you may need to step near the computer in order for us to hear you. Did I see a hand raised? Yes, please, but come close to the computer. And you, like I say, you may, I hope I'll be able to hear you. Go ahead. You may need to hit the space bar on the computer. I'm not hearing anything at the moment. I heard that, but I'm not hearing you. There we go. There we go.
Okay, I'm asking if there's some industries that are doing really well with this and others that are doing a lot worse. And what does that say about where the economy is growing or falling?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. And so, yes, there are some industries that are doing better. So technology in general as a sector has been doing better. And that is reflective of the fact that so many of us are working from home and using technology for our work, right? And that's one sector that's doing better. Online consumer goods doing very well. Amazon, other services that deliver to the home, online grocery suppliers doing very well. It's also produced some very specific results. And so I'll just mention one. Tesla has done much better at maintaining its production than other automobile manufacturers. That's in part because it's less globalized, depends less on global supply chains. You may have seen Tesla stock is through the roof, right? And people are writing about Elon Musk becoming, I think it's the 5th richest man in the world. And so, yes, there are some industries that are bucking this, but I think we need to be careful here in thinking that means this is an uneven economy. This is a very badly damaged economy overall. And that $600 unemployment benefit has propped it up a little bit. The fact that I think some people believe that this would be a short-term economic downturn, and that as soon as we figured out how to manage the virus, the underlying economy was actually strong, we would bounce back quickly, I think sustained some of us as well. I think as we now see the data on the last quarter, and as we reckon with the fact that the virus remains largely out of control in our society, we can expect further economic contraction, I'm sorry to say, and that may begin to damage the industries that so far have dodged the bullet in terms of the coronavirus. All right, good question, thank you. And I'm gonna unmute and let's see, I believe you should be able to speak. Go ahead. I'm not hearing you. You might, okay, go ahead now, hit spacebar. Okay. No, I'm still not hearing you. Is Grace there? She was able to do this pretty easily. There you go. There you go. Go ahead.
Instead of just the unemployment insurance, creating some jobs for these people and paying them that way, going back to 1930 and doing some creativity.
Yeah, so absolutely, and so somebody asked me at the beginning of class for a recommendation reading about FDR, and I was going to suggest New Deal, and they said no, not New Deal, but obviously we have precedent for dealing with severe economic contraction, and let me point out to you that many other developed countries, as opposed to giving an unemployment benefit to their workers, have given direct assistance to employers so that they keep their employees on the payroll and paid. We've done that in a very minor way with what's called PPP, Payroll Protection Plan, which did give some assistance to small businesses, but inadequate to incentivize them to fully retain and pay all their employees, whereas many other developed countries did it that way. Alternatively, we could do something along the idea of a New Deal or a New Deal or a Green New Deal, something that would be a massive public works job creation program. Yes, I do think there's need for a multifaceted approach to this. We need to, because the dominant force in our economy is obviously the private sector. We need to stabilize private sector jobs, but we also need to be doing something for the people who lose their private sector jobs. Much better to put them to work for the government than to just dole out money to them. But until we come up to speed, of course, part of the problem with massive public works programs is they take time to come online. And so they would not be probably actually creating jobs for at least 6 months. This is uncharted territory, to be clear, right? This is a pandemic causing a vast recession. And so the policy tools that we have to deal with recessions aren't really built for that. And as you see with the data, earlier recessions typically come online slowly. So we've got time to anticipate them, time to begin to react to them. This occurred both with stunning rapidity, so fast, and also with such depth that it's really very difficult to respond to. But we do need to start thinking about the fact that this is not going to go away in the near term. And so we need to be doing something about it that is going to counteract its economic consequences while we figure out how to cope with it from a public health perspective. Good, thank you for the question. Let me unmute again and just see, is there anybody else who has a question at this juncture? All right, then if not, I'm going to mute everyone again and go ahead and if you have a question, just hit the space bar, or you can also raise your hand using the chat function. But let me get back into the presentation. One moment, please. I have it here. All right. Give me 1 second. Okay. The last piece of economic information I should have shared with you is that this is a global downturn, not just an American recession. And obviously that makes things more difficult. This is a pandemic, right? And what makes it a pandemic is that it is a global health crisis. And so it is producing global economic consequences. We can see this on the data from China. We can also see it on the data from Europe, which I'm sharing with you right now. And as you can see, the Eurozone has seen a contraction that is even more severe than the contraction in the United States. Its economy was not doing as well prior to the pandemic contraction. You can see it had actually entered a slight recession before the pandemic hit. And the pandemic hit there earlier. Now, one of the questions will be the Europeans, as I've shown you, have had greater success in coping with the pandemic. Will their economy start to come back more quickly? Similar questions with regards to China. The economic data are not as reliable coming out of China. I haven't shared them with you today, but there seems to be some pretty clear evidence that China is contracting. Will that last? Or will their better results managing the virus allow them to slowly, cautiously emerge and begin to resume their economic activity? Transitioning back into today's lecture, I'll just refresh your memory. We were talking about T.M. Scanlon together at the end last week. We were in particular talking about the anatomy of reasons to resist inequality that he provides. And I know that was an abrupt transition. Let me just very quickly remind you that we've been talking for quite a while now together about rising inequality in the United States, and we've reached the final stretch of this lecture series, and we're talking about what to do to resist rising inequality. Part of that is having the arguments that make it clear why it is that rising inequality is objectionable. And I suggested to you that Emeritus Professor of Philosophy T.M. Scanlon at Harvard University provides us with perhaps the most comprehensive playbook for arguing against inequality in his book, which I was just showing you the title, Why Does Inequality Matter? And without revisiting the entire set of reasons, I'll remind you that we were looking at two arguments that have parallel structures, one on fair equality of opportunity, the other on political fairness. And that Scanlon is not saying we need perfect equality in terms of economic outcomes or in terms of our impact on the political process. But he is saying that if there is inequality, if incomes and wealth differ, if some people make arguments that have a greater impact on the political process, certain conditions have to be met to make sure that that is fair. And that for equality of opportunity, the institutions that generate the inequality have to be good for all of us. If we pay surgeons more in order to encourage them to be the best qualified and to have thorough, comprehensive training, that's good for all of us. We all want to have well-trained surgeons. If we pay CEOs 400 times what we pay average workers, does that make their firms more productive in ways that benefit all of us? And I'm sorry to say, but according to Harvard Business Review and other sources of data, that's simply not the case. Actually, firms that pay their CEOs the most actually tend to be less productive than firms that pay their CEOs in the average range of CEO compensation. And there's very little evidence. As a matter of fact, again, the evidence seems to be primarily against the proposition that increasing CEO pay across time has increased the productivity of firms. And so in a sense, it's not good for all of us that CEO compensation be so high. And so it fails that test of institutional fairness. There's also a test of fairness in filling positions. Does everybody have an equal, fair chance of becoming a surgeon or becoming a CEO? And Scanlon suggests that it's only in those circumstances, the circumstance in particular in which we select the people for the highest compensated, most powerful, most prestigious positions who are best qualified for those positions. There's no old boys network. There's no nepotism. There's no arbitrary advantage assigned to someone because they went to this or that school or have this or that network, right? That in that case, then we can say it's both good for society that we have these positions, and it is fair that this person has that position, right? And then finally, substantive background fairness says that all persons have a fair, equal opportunity to develop the relevant qualifications. The fact that I was born to a relatively poor family does not mean that I'm not going to get a decent education in science and then be qualified to get into the college or university that will allow me to get into the medical school that will allow me to become a surgeon, right? It's not the case that all the surgeons come from wealthy families. In that case, then, right, we can say fair equality of opportunity has been met. Scanlon points out there's a similar pattern with political fairness. That is to say, we don't create institutions that create positions of authority that have too much power in them such that it threatens the liberty or equality or the rights of the rest of us. So the power that is invested in political office is limited and acceptable to all of us. And then again, right, that there is a fair process of competing for political office. Not everybody who rises to the top comes from the same dynastic family or is from a relatively wealthy background. Please note that almost everybody in the Congress in the United States today is a millionaire. And obviously that then on its face seems to fail this idea, right? And then in the background, each person has a fair, equal opportunity, both to acquire relevant political information, to form political associations if they want to lobby or organize around something, and to influence the outcome of political decision-making, right? To actually have an impact. And so substantive background fairness is different in politics than it is in economics, but there's a parallel to them. And Scanlon suggests if we have too great an economic inequality in our society, as we've been examining together, then we're unlikely to have either fair equality of opportunity or political fairness. If we have too much economic inequality, this will allow those who are already advantaged to establish positions that are skewed to their further advantage. So if we look at what's happening with CEO compensation in the United States today, part of what we see is that the boards, the corporate boards that determine CEO compensation are drawn from people who are primarily themselves CEOs or a very narrow band of investors. If we compare that with much of Europe, the boards are not just shareholder boards, but so-called stakeholder boards. Both the employees of the firms receive a substantial share on the board, maybe as much as a third, and the consumers of the services or products that the firms produce are on the boards. And the result is that CEO compensation is much lower in the European Union than it is in the United States. And you might argue that average employees are treated better, and that the firms themselves embrace more of a public mission, that they're interested in what's good for their consumers, not only what's good for their investors. And so there are structural changes we could make, but in the absence of those changes, if there's greater inequality, this is going to distort the way in which firms and powerful economic actors are organized. It also will tend to skew the principle of selection. That is to say that the old boys network will be quite robust, intact, and influential. And finally, in a economy that has great inequality, those who are already advantaged are going to be able to invest in the next generation, in educating their children, in providing cultivation for their children that makes the competition for future opportunity inherently unequal and unfair, that you can pass not only wealth, but competitive advantage down to the next generation. All right, political fairness is also undermined by economic inequality because it enables the disproportionately powerful, those who have a great deal of income and wealth, to ignore the interests or violate the rights of others, to dilute voting power or disenfranchise those who are not as advantaged, and to politically marginalize, ignore, disorganize, deny information, I say benight to make it concise, or alienate the less powerful. And one of the things we see is that in more unequal societies, even if they are democratically organized, fewer people participate in democratic politics, and the poor participate less than the wealthy do. And you might think that that's exactly the reverse of what the incentive structure should be, right? The poor don't have much wealth, but what they do have is an equal vote. Why wouldn't they use their vote to equalize the playing field with those who have a lot of wealth? Well, because they recognize that those who have a lot of wealth are able to translate their unequal wealth into disproportionate influence on the political process. Let's look at this in the United States for a moment, some data. What you can see is that in the United States, the top 1% has a huge share of our wealth, right? 11% of the wealth in the United States is controlled not by the top 1% or the top 0.1%, but by the top 0.01%. And that's gone up from 3% in 1980. It's more than tripled, almost quadrupled in the last 40 years. But it's even worse when we look at campaign funding, right? How much does the top 0.01% contribute to the financing of political campaigns? It is 40% of registered political campaign contributions. And I would just point out to you that this is based on public filings. If we were to be able to trace, and we can't trace all the so-called dark money that enters American politics, all of the money that comes in through donations to super PACs, not all of that is divulged. This number of 40% would probably go up to 50 or 60 or 75%. I'm making this up because the data isn't there. But what seems clear is that these contributions are in fact limited by law. The other contributions are not at all limited. There is no reason to believe that the hyper wealthy don't contribute the vast lion's share to financing of political activity and speech in the United States, and that obviously then gives them a disproportionate influence over our politics. If we look at this in terms of a slightly different way of diagramming this, and this is 2010, the average political contribution for 99.7% of the population was less than $200 per person, right? But for the top 0.2%, 2.6%, they were giving tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, to the point where they gave the vast majority of the money that was spent in that election cycle. So, right, this diagram shows you what that looks like, right? Out of this field of people, this little percentage gives the bulk of the money, and obviously then again has disproportionate influence. One of the things we know is that the higher spending candidate usually wins an election. By the way, that's typically the incumbent because they have a fundraising advantage. So for the House, it's between 80 and 90% of the time in most of the recent elections. For the Senate, it's between 70 and 80% of the time that the higher spending candidate wins. All right, so I am now done presenting you the reasons why it is that we should object to inequality. And I imagine, I think I know you well enough to know that many of you are, if not full-blown egalitarians, at least disturbed with rising inequality in the United States in the way that I have tried to document it to you for the weeks we've spent together on this topic. What Scanlon and other philosophers do is to provide us with, as I've put it, a rigorous anatomy of the moral reasons to reject inequality, to take our intuition that this is a bad thing and to flesh it out and to say, it's not just that I think this or feel this or it's my hunch. There are important, well-developed, persuasive arguments to back up those intuitions. Now, I want to point out to you, and again, I'm getting there, but I'm not all the way there. What remains in our discussion of this, and I'm going to just give you a little overview of what I will be talking with you about in detail next week. And that is that we need what I'm going to call a comprehensive suite of equality promoting policy reforms. And I want to suggest to you that this should be thought about in two broad stages. One set of reforms would be the reforms that I think have some prospect of being adopted here and now. Maybe not between now and November. Very little gets done in terms of substantive policy initiatives in the immediate buildup to a national election, but in the next year, much of this, it seems to me, could be done. And I want to be clear, and I'll talk more about this next week, the combination of the pandemic, the economic downturn that it's causing, and the spotlight that the killing of George Floyd and the national protests on Black Lives Matter, police violence, racial inequality have shown on the persistence of racial inequality in this country create a perhaps once every 50 years opportunity for a genuine national conversation that results in new significant restructuring legislation, right? And so in a sense, I think even if we're talking about stage one, the stuff that can be done in the next year, we may be at a particularly opportune moment for that. I would point out to you that one of the things I'll be talking about at this stage is reform that can proceed in the absence of national legislation. And some of this will require national legislation, but some of it might be capable of being done at the state level, at the local level, even at the level of a college or a university or an employer, etc. And so not everything needs to wait until we can break the partisan paralysis that has paralyzed Washington for much of the last 50 years and frankly allowed inequality to take root in such a problematic way. There are things that we can do here and now. And I'll talk with you more about this next week, but it seems to me even modest change at the local level or in a college or a university or with an employer might demonstrate that change is possible. And I think what we're seeing with the protests in the streets and what they're doing to public opinion is that public opinion does appear to be somewhat more malleable at the moment than it has been in the past. And so maybe local change that demonstrates that change is possible starts what's sometimes called an opinion change cascade. If they can do it there, why can't we do it here? If we've done it here and they've done it there, why can't we do it as a nation as opposed to just having piecemeal reform? So stage one concerns the relatively easy stuff to do. Stage two concerns the stuff that's going to take real difficult political will and resolve that will require national legislation of a kind that isn't just an emergency response to a pandemic and the economic crisis it's produced, or the protests in the streets around Black Lives Matter, that will require a recommitment to the agenda of equality in the United States. And so I will also talk with you about those more ambitious efforts and some of the political changes that would be required to bring them about. That's where we're going, and that is where we will focus in the coming week. For today, I do want to stop and now give you a chance to ask questions. I'm going to unmute everyone again. Please try to keep the background noise to a minimum. And who wants to start us out? Anybody have a question? Go ahead. I can see in the atrium that there's a question. Can you, I think you, no, I can't hear you. I think you're going to need to unmute on the computer. Very good. Now
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah, you're great.
Yes, I can.
It says unmute.
Okay, have you heard of what I thought I heard the other day, that Trump said something about not allowing affordable housing in all neighborhoods? I don't think.
Yes, I absolutely have. And so I can talk to you in a little bit of detail about that. To be clear, this is a part of legislation that was passed in the late 1960s. It's an anti-discrimination legislation in housing. That legislation has two dimensions to it. And as you may know, not only is it the case that American cities are, most of them, hyper segregated, right? And I could show you some data on this. Chicago is a clear example. If you look at the map of segregation in Chicago, it's a black and white city, right? The African Americans are strongly concentrated in the south of Chicago and the west of Chicago. That was done by design, by policy, by law, right? As African Americans were migrating to Chicago from the South in the 1930s and 1940s and the 1950s, the city of Chicago passed laws preventing African Americans from moving into certain neighborhoods, did demolition projects to clear certain neighborhoods for African Americans, and then built housing projects that are essentially segregated housing projects. And we've seen the images. We know what this looks like. And in addition to that, the real estate industry worked to keep American residential patterns strongly segregated. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of a covenant in a housing contract. Or when you buy the house, it comes with a rider, a covenant, so-called, that says you cannot sell this house to an African American. The real estate industry created those covenants in order to keep housing segregated. And then in addition to that, there's the practice of so-called redlining, where banks, including the federal agencies that were insuring mortgages or supporting home ownership, including the federal agencies administering the GI Bill, which is the largest single support for middle income house acquisition in American history, also drew red lines on maps that said, we will not issue mortgage insurance for anybody who lives in these areas. And by the way, of course, those areas were dominantly African American areas. And it was not done on the basis of objective economic analysis. It was done on the basis of racist suppositions about Blacks not being economically reliable, and so not wanting to give federal mortgage support for those areas. The legislation from 1968 said you can't do any of that anymore, right? That's the main way in which that legislation has been interpreted and enforced. But there was another provision in that legislation that said that if a community in the past has engaged in discrimination in order to segregate its housing, either private or public, it will need to take remedial steps. Now, essentially, that provision of the 1968 anti-discrimination legislation has really never been enforced. There are a few cases. I would point out, for instance, Mount Laurel, New Jersey, did lose a court case around the fact that it essentially cleared all of its public housing in the 1960s and went from being a more or less integrated, diverse community to being an entirely white suburb. And it lost litigation. It took almost 20 years before it actually started implementing the settlement to the litigation, but they did create housing for African Americans. Significant number of families, over 1,000, moved out of Camden, New Jersey, and the children of those families are doing much better economically as a result of the enforcement of that provision. But that's one of the very few cases in which that provision has been enforced in recent history. But in 2015, the Department of Justice, when Barack Obama was still the president, said, we're going to start looking into the enforcement of this provision. Obviously, not a lot happened because Barack Obama was out of office a year later. What Trump is saying is that he is reversing that Department of Justice policy. And clearly, this is part of a re-election campaign. That if you put a Democrat in the White House, they're going to start trying to integrate the suburbs, and the result is going to be that your property value is going to go down. That's the basic ploy here. But please note that really this does not amount to a meaningful policy change, because the law in question has basically almost never been enforced, despite being on the books for over 50 years. This is a topic for another day. As you may hear, I've actually been doing some research on this, and I'm thinking about actually maybe the next set of lectures I do for you will be on the origins and ways in which racial inequality are sustained in the United States. Racial segregation, unequal home ownership are very high up the list of problems there. And of course, it's unfortunate from my point of view that the President of the United States is not interested in addressing the problem so much as using the threat that the problem might be addressed to mobilize fear in order to increase his chance of re-election. It seems to me that's not just a partisan way to describe this. This is an objective fact of American social life, that we have become more unequal in terms of income and wealth through the 20th and 21st century in terms of race, and we need to do something about it. I've unmuted everyone again so I can get the next question. Thank you for the good question. I hope that I didn't lose the forest for the trees. Trump is threatening to undo something that isn't even being done.
Yeah. I don't have a question. I have a comment. I wish that Biden would nominate Elizabeth Warren as the vice president. Because we need.
So let me talk to 10 seconds for 10 seconds about that. And I think in a sense, I'm with you. If what we want is Joe Biden to be an active progressive Democrat, he probably needs somebody holding his feet to the fire, somebody who is energetic and progressive in the number 2 position would be a good person to do that, right? Now, having said that, I am all but certain he's not going to nominate Elizabeth Warren. And I will just briefly tell you why. He is doing electoral math. What gets him elected? And there is a risk that he will lose some of the progressive Democrats because they're not convinced that he's a genuine progressive, and maybe nominating Elizabeth Warren to be his vice president, selecting her, would be a good way to assure them. But the truth of the matter is, the real threat to Joe Biden, who is doing very well in the polls right now, right? And by the way, American public opinion is starting to shift on the question of Biden's electability. For a long time, people said, well, Biden is doing well in the polls, but we still think Trump is going to win ultimately. People are starting to change their mind on that as we see Biden sustaining an 8 to 10% lead over Trump now for 2 months in a row. What does Biden need to win? He really needs suburban, moderate voters, white women in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona to support him. And to be honest, those women probably, those voters probably don't want Warren as much as they want a moderate. So I don't know who it's going to be. I suppose maybe by the time we speak next week, we won't have to guess about this anymore. I'll just say to you, I think Susan Rice is looking quite probable, and that's not based on inside information. It's just that in a sense, she doesn't have some of the domestic baggage that anyone else who is running or in the running for the vice presidency does. She's got clear foreign policy bona fides, and Biden apparently has a strong, long-standing working relationship with her as well. Anybody else with a final question? We've gone long today, but that's fine. Anybody want to ask a last question? All right, then I'm going to wish everybody well. Please continue to be vigilant and safe. The data for New York looks pretty good right now on the virus, but please remember that what the data shows is really how things were 10 days ago, not how they are right now. So we won't know when things are getting bad until they're already getting bad. So be careful, be vigilant, take care, be well, and I will see you all next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.